sad reality is that classrooms today are losing students. Students are physically present but mentally absent. And this is because traditional education increasingly fails to compete with the attention economy students are raised in, an economy built with interaction, visual speed, and stimulation. However, the problem is that schools have failed to evolve, and if education are meant to maximize learning, the schools must teach students in ways students can actually engage with more than past to propose. 3 points of aiming. First, new generations have short attention span due to technology. Second, most schools are underfunded and rely on primitive curriculums. Third, by primary education method, we mean school mainly relying on engaging interactive teaching methods such as educational games, simulation, etc. So moving on to our first argument, edutainment makes students actually engage with learning. That is, students learn better when they're emotionally and mentally engaged. Traditional classrooms often depend on passive learning, long lectures, memorization, etc. The issue here is that the passive exposures is not the same as active learning. The students frequently zone out and forget information immediately after. Then how does edutainment change this dynamic? First, interactive learning changes participation, games, storytelling, and simulations and visual learning for students to actively respond rather than passively learn this information and gets forced to receive this information. Second, enjoyment drastically improve retention because people naturally remember experiences that are tied to emotions and excitement. Third, edutainment especially helps struggling students. Many students disengage not because they're incapable, but traditional learning methods to fail to accommodate things
POI,
like ADHD, visual learners, and etc. To impact
POI.
your rate. First, schools reduce apathy and engagement disengagement. This is why students become more willing to attend class, participate, and more. Second, learning becomes more accessible and democratic under traditional education heavily favors students already naturally good at concentration. Yeah, I'll accept your POI. No, okay. Argument two is that on how education is excessive and effective and accessible. A interactive and learning uh, methods are more relatable and enjoyable for a generation raised on short form content, digital media, and hyper interactivity. When education is no longer treated as a chore, something students actually want, it naturally increases the classroom participation and attention. For instance, students are far more likely to engage with historical concepts to role play instead of memorization. Second, edutainment fosters motivation through emotion and participation. Games, simulations, and collaborative activities actually help engage the students. See, the third, edutainment is highly accessible compared to alternative methods because compared to solutions such as remedial classes, hiring significant more qualified teachers, investing heavily into infrastructure, or relying on expensive private tutoring, interactive methods are much more easier and cheaper to implement within all classes. Of course, unlike traditional learning environments where feedback is often really delayed until exams or assignments are graded, edutainment allows students to receive immediate responses, classroom simulation with collaborative activities. Students can quickly identify misunderstandings and remain quickly involved in lessons. This makes the entire learning process more efficient and responsive. Because this, I am proud to propose.
If the problem today is that no one picks up a book anymore, the solution cannot be to transform schools into entertainment centers. In a world where students already struggle to concentrate, we heavily doubt that constantly stimulating students will allow them to develop meaning academic habits or intellectual discipline. Our counterfactual is pre-existing in traditional learning methods such as lectures, textbooks, essay writing, um, independent reading, note-taking, memorization, and disciplined classroom environments. These methods may not always be entertaining, but they cultivate concentration, reflection, and intellectual endurance, which we oppose replacing. I'll now be moving on to my rebuttals. The opposing teams talked about how edutainment makes students actually engage with learning. However, government is confusing engagement with meaningful education. Just because students are entertained or participating more does not mean they're developing deep understanding, concentration, or independent thinking. In many cases, students engage more with the activity itself than the academic content behind it. They remember the game or the video, but they fail to deeply internalize the material. Schools are not meant to compete with TikTok or entertainment platforms. Their role is to build discipline, intellectual patience, and long-term academic habits. Two, they also bring up the point how edutainment improves accessibility for struggling students. Yes, we agree education should definitely be accessible, but simplifying and constantly stimulating learning is not the same as solving educational inequality. On government, students become dependent on entertainment in order to focus. This means that when subjects become difficult, repetitive, or less stimulating, struggling students disengage even faster. I will now be moving on to my arguments. Our first argument is that excessive reliance on entertainment leads to the loss of intrinsic motivation. Edutainment is fundamentally based on external stimulation, whether through exciting visuals, storytelling, games, or emotionally engaging activities. Students become motivated not by learning itself, but by whether the experience is enjoyable enough to sustain attention. In contrast, traditional learning environments focus on gradual self-development and internal discipline. Intrinsic motivation refers to engaging in learning for its own satisfaction, solving math problems because it's intellectually rewarding, or exploring history out of curiosity rather than because the lesson is entertaining. This curiosity is crowded out on when the source of motivation becomes entertainment. Two impacts here. First, students that struggle academically become further demotivated in the long term. On government, students become dependent on entertainment to focus. This means when subjects become inevitably difficult, repetitive, or less stimulating, students disengage even more quickly and learn helplessness. Second, there's no long-term investment for academic success. Constantly prioritizing enjoyable learning environments builds students who are less willing to pursue difficult long-term goals, requiring delayed gratification and sustained concentration, such as becoming doctors, researchers, professors, or engineers. Government may get students to participate more temporarily, but entertaining activities can already exist occasionally within lessons or after school. The classroom must primarily encourage critical thinking, discipline, concentration, and independent learning habits. The comparative is clear. Even if students struggle in our world, there's a difference between learning to overcome difficulty independently versus constantly expecting education to adapt around environment and stimulation. Argument two is that entertainment is one of the worst foundations for education. The purpose of edutainment is fundamentally different from traditional education because it intensifies stimulation and emotional engagement to hold the student's attention. Schools then become pressured to compete with entertainment platforms like YouTube, TikTok, or other video games. This makes traditional learning methods increasingly unbearable and causes entertainment-based learning to become the dominant way students expect to learn. Edutainment often provides shallow education. Unlike books, essays, or sustained classroom discussion, entertainment education educational methods simplify concepts emotionally disengaging or easily digestible content. However, many difficult subjects require slow reflection, repetition, ambiguity, and deep concentration. Fast-paced, stimulating activities leave little space for independent thought or conceptual processing. Students remember the activity itself, but fail to deeply internalize the academic material. For these reasons, proud to oppose. Thank you.
Schools today are failing to compete for students' attention in a world filled with constant stimulation, interactivity, and accessible information. And the traditional classroom model, with long lectures, memorization, and passive note-taking, were designed for a time when schools were the primary source of knowledge. But this is no longer true because students can already access information online within seconds, and therefore the role of schools should no longer simply be to transfer the information, but to make students meaningfully engage with and apply that information. And edutainment responds to this reality. By combining education with engaging in interactive methods, schools can actually create learning environments that students actively want to participate in rather than emotionally detached from. And on government side, we believe education should evolve alongside society, not remain trapped in outdated systems that increasingly fail students with short attention spans like in the modernized world. Some rebuttals before moving on to the argument. So they talked about how edutainment destroys intrinsic motivation. However, this argument sounds intuitive, but it completely misunderstands how motivation actually works for most students. First, opposition romanticizes traditional education as students are currently passionately reading textbook for the love of learning, but this is simply just false. Most students already study because of grades, like parental pressure, exams, or like university admissions for later jobs, or the fear of punishment. And traditional schooling is already heavily dependent on external motivation, and government simply makes learning engaging through for students to actually participate meaningfully instead of mentally checking out. And something being enjoyable does not mean it lacks educational value. And humans naturally learn better when they're emotionally engaged. And that is why documentaries teach like history effectively, because we are able to emotionally connect, and experiments teach science effectively, and debates teach politics or whatever topic
POI.
effectively. No, thank you. And the problem with their side is that they just treat boredom as evidence of educational quality, when boredom often just signals the poor teaching that they get. And third, they massively exaggerate dependence on stimulation. And we never said every lesson becomes like TikTok videos and flashing lights. And we never said our model just doesn't include like essays, exams, or like difficult assignments that actually need concentration. And the difference is that students are gradually introduced into learning through engagement first, rather than immediately alienated by rigid and repetitive structures. Rebuttal to their second argument of how entertainment is like a bad foundation for education. For this argument relies on and we're not replacing schools with YouTube shorts or video games, like we already said. And we're saying education should use engaging methods to improve understanding and participation. And opposition assumes that engaging is shallow, and this is simply untrue. And simulation, storytelling, interactive discussion, and role play often like creates deeper understanding than memorizing textbook paragraphs, because students actively apply concepts rather than passively consuming them. So now moving on to our third argument, which is on how edutainment modernizes the classroom. And at its core, edutainment transforms education from a passive system of instruction into an active system of participation. And currently, most classrooms are teacher-centered, and students sit silently, copy notes, and memorize contents, and repeat information during exams. And the problem is that this model assumes students learn best through passive absorption. And in reality, many students mentally disengage because they feel disconnected from the material actually being taught. And they're treated as containers for information rather than actively participating in this learning. And edutainment changes this dynamic entirely. And instead of students merely just receiving the information, they're encouraged to interact with it through like games, just like Kahoot. They're able to play the game to actually get the question right and get rewards. And storytelling is like simulations, collaborative activities, discussions, and actual multimedia experiences. And this matters because students can actually learn better when they're emotionally and mentally engaged. Information becomes easier to retain when students can actively experience concepts rather than mechanically like memorizing them. And that is why when there's like psychological like experiments, they have like these people actually like emotionally engage with one another to actually have their result. And lessons become associated with curiosity, participation, and problem solving rather than the boredom and obligation. And more importantly, this changes the role of teachers in a positive way. And teachers are no longer forced to spend most of their class time acting as human PowerPoints that repeat information students can like easily search online. And instead, teachers can focus on guiding the discussion, encouraging critical thinking, and helping students actually apply this knowledge onto their test or whatever. And this creates a classroom that develops understanding rather than simple memorization. And secondly, edutainment improves digital literacy, which is increasingly essential in the modern economy. And finally, edutainment creates classrooms that are more adaptable and inclusive, and not every student learns effectively through lectures and rote memorization. And for these reasons, how to propose.
Entire case relies on one dangerous assumption that if students enjoy learning more, education automatically gets better. But simply increasing engagement does not necessarily create deeper understanding, stronger academic habits, or long-term intellectual growth. In fact, by making the entertainment the primary condition for learning, government gradually conditions students to reject any form of education that requires patience, repetition, or sustained effort. Based on this, my argument is on how students become unable to adapt to future academic and professional settings. But before that, I will begin my rebuttals. Government's entire case relies on the assumption that if students enjoy more, learning more, education automatically gets better. However, engagement alone does not necessarily create deeper understanding, discipline, or long-term academic success and intellectual endurance needed for a serious academic environment. This side admits that modern students already struggle with short-term attention spans because of technology and overstimulation. But instead of solving this issue, government chooses to adapt education entirely around it. Schools are supposed to develop focus, patience, and independent thinking, not reinforce dependency on constant stimulation and entertainment. Additionally, government exaggerates the effectiveness of participation-heavy learning. Students does not automatically mean students develop the ability to handle difficult learning, reading, independent research, repetitive practice, or sustained
POI.
concentration, all of which are
So then
yes, I accept.
how are students going to learn if enjoyment isn't one necessary way for them to learn things?
Could you rephrase?
Okay, so if you're keep saying that students don't learn through enjoyment, then how will students?
Students will learn through lectures and actual deep focus in endurance of studying instead of simply just learning through games, which they might only remember in role play and entertaining activities, which will not help them later in the future. Now, moving back to my speech. Additionally, government exaggerates the effectiveness of participation-heavy learning. Students may enjoy interactive activities more, but enjoyment does not automatically mean students develop the ability to handle difficult reading, independent research, repetitive practice, or sustained concentration, all of which are still necessary in universities and professional environments. This becomes especially harmful long-term because universities and workplaces will not constantly redesign themselves around entertainment. Students who become dependent on stimulation-heavy learning environments are more likely to struggle in lecture halls, independent study settings, or repetitive work responsibilities, where motivation and this temporary engagement outweighs the long-term importance of discipline, focus, and adaptability. Now, finishing my rebuttals and moving on to my argument, the reality is that most students want to do well at school in order to go to a good college, and some time down for both paths. First, colleges in general will still heavily rely on traditional learning teaching methods, as most higher education environments depend on independent reading, lectures, essays, and research papers, and self-discipline. Additionally, colleges require students to be self-motivated. No one wakes you up for class, plans your schedules, or constantly entertaining you into learning. Excellence depends on discipline and intellectual endurance. Second, employers will care even less about constantly making work enjoyable and stimulating. Oftentimes, they will simply not hire people who lack concentration, self-regulation, and professionalism, or B, fire employees over time if they cannot perform repetitive or difficult tasks without needing constant stimulation and entertainment. Proud to propose.
So this debate comes down to who helps the students the best. However, we never say that school should become all games and fun. And they're assuming that our school are going to be like playing video games all day and then saying that these students learned. And we only say that learning should be more interesting and easier to understand. And opposition thinks difficult and boring learning automatically makes students smarter since they're sitting on a desk and listening to lectures. And before I move on to my two classes, I would like to mention a bit of rebuttals. So their point about how students will learn better in old school learning. So first of all, this is not true because of three reasons. So number one, hard and boring classes do not always help students learn better. Number two, many students already cannot focus in normal lecture classes. And number three, government still keeps tests. We still keep tests, homework, and difficult subjects. We're not going to just replace gaming with everything. And even if their point about this is true, even if old school learning builds discipline, it does not matter if students stop caring about school. Even if edutainment is less strict, more students will join and understand the lessons. And even if students enjoy learning more, that is good because they will not hate education. If students enjoy the game, they'll only remember about the game. So first of all, this is not true because of three reasons. So number one, students are not always enjoying the game, and because they're learning through the game. So the game isn't always the purpose for these students. And it isn't always the goal. And games and videos help students understand remember the lessons better. And we still teach real subjects, not just edutainment. And lastly, their point about if students will enjoy the fun activity, they will still gain knowledge and learning from it. And moving on to my two classes. So number one, the first class, what helps students learn better? The opposition keeps saying the fun does not equal learning, and edutainment makes students learn if they stop paying attention, and edutainment changes the teaching style, not the education itself. So it's just a mere adaptation to the society. It's not changing education itself as a whole. So for a few examples here, so a few examples here, Josh. So imagine you are a student and you're having some trouble learning because you have like some disorders such as ADHD and those people, and mentioning that they do not protect these vulnerable people since old school learning is like for these normal people. And Judge, imagine that you're a student, like an ADHD student. What education would you prefer? An education where you can like play games and understand the education, or an education where you just have to sit down and immediately forget the knowledge you learned before? And moving on to the second class, which side prepares students for a better future? And before I move on, I would like to take any POIs. Okay, so assuming that there are no POIs, so moving on to the clash. So opposition keeps on saying that students will depend too much on entertainment and they will struggle in university and work. However, we tell you that modern jobs actually include these kinds of entertainment, because some jobs include like computer programming, and through old school learning, you'll only learn like how to program these computers, and you won't experience as much with the computers as edutainment, because you're using the computers in your daily lives to adapt to the real world. The real world also adapts like a school. So sometimes if you learn adaptation in school, you'll be well adapted to the real world better. So a few points on important framing here. So the opposition creates a false choice. And we never say that we're going to remove homeworks and exams and difficult subjects. We're just going to make students more willing to learn. And a few points on analysis here. So opposition treats boredom like it's something good, and then they blame the struggle on students for lacking discipline. And this can cause students to losing interest in school and frustration through learning and higher dropout risk. So we're protecting the students at the same time. So why we take this class, 2 points on here. Students who hate learning will never become disciplined learners, and engagement comes first and discipline comes after. So in conclusion, what I mentioned here is that opposition protects old school traditions, and we protect students and adaptability. Therefore, I'm very proud to propose.
I'll start. Okay. The government side says that schools should use edutainment as their main method of education. They argue that it helps students engage, is effective and accessible, and modernizes the classroom. While we agree that engagement and modernization are important, we strongly disagree that edutainment should become the primary foundation of education. First, government says edutainment makes students actually engage with their learning. We disagree with the idea that edutainment is the best way to create real engagement. Students may look more interested in the short term, but this is often surface level engagement. They're enjoying the formats, not always deeply understanding the context. Real learning requires focus, patience, and effort, especially when topics are difficult. If students only engage when something is entertaining, they will struggle when learning becomes challenging or less fun. Second, government says edutainment is effective and accessible. We agree accessibility matters, but we reject the idea that edutainment automatically makes education more effective. In fact, excessive reliance on edutainment can reduce effectiveness. Students may focus on more on jokes, visuals, or games than on the actual academic content. This creates shallow learning instead of deep understanding. Also, accessible does not mean best. Just because something is easier to consume does not mean it leads to strong long-term learning outcomes. Third, government says that edutainment modernizes the classroom. We strongly reject the idea that modernization means replacing serious learning with edutainment. Modern education should improve teaching methods, not remove discipline from learning. Schools are not just places for fun, they are places that prepare students for exams, universities, and real-world careers. In those environments, learning is structured, focused, and sometimes difficult. If students are trained mostly through entertainment, they may struggle to adapt later in life when learning is not entertaining. Now I'll move on to the clashes. The first clashes is engagement versus depth. government focuses on making students interested in the moment, but we focus on whether students actually understand and retain knowledge. Engagement without depth is meaningless in education. A student can be entertained and still learn very little. True education requires deep thinking, not just education. The second clash is accessibility versus quality. Government argues that edutainment is more accessible, but we argue that accessibility should not reduce quality. Making learning easier is good, but not if weakens understanding. It weakens understanding. Education must challenge students so they grow, not just make things comfortable or simple. The third clash is about modernization versus preparation. Government says edutainment modernizes education, but we show that real modernization should prepare students for real world conditions. But workplaces, exams, and higher education require discipline and focus, not constant entertainment. If students are trained mainly through fun-based learning, they will struggle when learning becomes serious. In conclusion, edutainment can be a useful tool, but it cannot be the primary method of education. Over-reliance on entertainment weakens deep learning, reduces academic discipline, and fails to prepare students for real-world demands. That is why the opposition proudly stands against this motion. Thank you.
This debate was never about whether entertainment can help learning. We already agreed that fun activities can occasionally exist in classrooms. The real debate was whether entertainment should become the main way schools teach students, and we believe government failed to prove why that would be better in the long term. Government focused a lot about engagement and participation, but being entertained is not the same thing as getting a good education. Just because students enjoy activities more does not mean that they are developing a deep understanding, concentration, or independent thinking. Many times, students remember the game or activity more than the actual lesson itself. We showed that schools are supposed to help students build discipline, focus, and ability to handle difficult learning. These are important skills for higher education and future careers. On government, students become more dependent for stimulation and engagement in order to focus. This means that when learning becomes difficult or less exciting, students disengage much more quickly. Government also argued that edutainment modernizes classrooms and improves digital literacy. But schools can teach technology skills without turning education into entertainment. Schools should not have to compete with TikTok or other video games just to keep students interested. In fact, if students already struggle with attention spans, constantly increasing stimulation might make the problem even worse. Ultimately, opposition gave the stronger long-term vision for education. We protect concentration, critical thinking, and independent learning instead of building a system based mainly on stimulation. For these reasons, I'm proud to oppose. Thank you. This debate was never about whether entertainment can help learning. We already agreed that fun activities can occasionally exist in classrooms. The real debate was whether entertainment should become the main way schools teach students, and we believe government failed to prove why that would be better in the long term. Government focused a lot about engagement and participation, but being entertained is not the same thing as getting a good education. Just because students enjoy activities more does not mean that they are developing a deep understanding, concentration, or independent thinking. Many times, students remember the game or activity more than the actual lesson itself. We showed that schools are supposed to help students build discipline, focus, and ability to handle difficult learning. These are important skills for higher education and future careers. On government, students become more dependent for stimulation and engagement in order to focus. This means that when learning becomes difficult or less exciting, students disengage much more quickly. Government also argued that edutainment modernizes classrooms and improves digital literacy. But schools can teach technology skills without turning education into entertainment. Schools should not have to compete with TikTok or other video games just to keep students interested. In fact, if students already struggle with attention spans, constantly increasing stimulation might make the problem even worse. Ultimately, opposition gave the stronger long-term vision for education. We protect concentration, critical thinking, and independent learning instead of building a system based mainly on stimulation. For these reasons, I'm proud to oppose. Thank you. This debate was never about whether entertainment can help learning. We already agreed that fun activities can occasionally exist in classrooms. The real debate was whether entertainment should become the main way schools teach students, and we believe government failed to prove.
So first, opposition only talks about the fact that education and entertainment doesn't mix, and this is their strongest points. They just say that like education is just it's just education only, and it will help them only. Like it will just it's the only way that people can learn, and it's the part that only people learn. We want to include everybody, but they don't respond to that, and we our side we have more people that learn. In the long term, we say that like more we keep saying that the long term, like there's more people learning, and we participating, concentrating actually means learning something. Opposition thinks that, but this is not true. Like we already said that participating means like we already said that learning, like we're not changing learning at all. At least we help modern more people. They keep ignoring the fact that learning is more interesting and learning, not replacing game. We're not replacing learning for gaming. Like gaming is not all. Like help to the modern society. It's short-term focus so that we are long-term in the end. Because the opposition only keeps pushing the point about the entertainment and education, and we keep reporting that their entire case falls and they don't respond to our case. So because of this, we win, and our arguments keep standing, and their arguments, their strategy loses, and this is why they lost this debate. I am proud.